Yonah Bob is the legal, intelligence, and terrorism analyst for the Jerusalem Post. He has been speaking professionally since 2000 in the United States, Canada, and Israel. He writes and lectures about security, diplomacy, international law, war, of course, lawfare, human rights, terror cases, major Supreme Court decisions, and other issues. And he has a new book out called Justice in the West Bank, the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Goes to Court. We are extremely privileged to have Yonah Bob come back and speak to us at the Lawfare Project, the world's only pro-Israel litigation fund. He will be starting off talking about his book for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to go into specific legal issues and cases that are facing, that Israel is facing today, and of course, open it up to our audience. Yonah, thank you for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Brooke. So glad to be back here again. And so glad to see both some new faces and some familiar faces from past times. Right, so the first 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to introduce the book a little bit. So what's this book about? It's about the military courts that deal with the Palestinians. And it's about four human beings, four main characters, two from each side who tell their stories. Some about the court cases themselves, some about their personal lives. You know, I didn't want it. I wanted this to be a book that people, especially in the United States and Europe, could read about without, you know, even if they don't have a legal background, to get interested in, you know, the human side of it. But what's it really about, and why should anyone actually care about whether there's justice in the West Bank or not in these courts? So it is actually about something very big and profound, which relates to some of the other issues we're going to discuss later. Can you be a democracy when you're involved in an indefinite, low-graded war or conflict? That's what the book's really about. I would argue that the answer is yes, but it's going to look different. It's going to look different than democracies where there isn't the same level of threat, the same level of conflict. Now, in one way, if we just stop there, that would actually be a terrible answer. Because as soon as you can say different, it's going to look different, where does it end, all right? You know, where does national security have to defer to human rights, or is national security always going to trump human rights considerations? Where you strike that balance, there's a wide, wide spectrum of solutions you can come up with, and where you go on that spectrum matters a lot. And that's why one thing I talk about in the book is reform ideas. You know, critics of Israel like to phrase things in terms of Israel is violating this convention and that convention. And Israel is very, very rarely violating convention. But there are plenty of times where people, even within the system, say we can improve. You know, we can observe human rights in a proactive way, maybe even if it's not obligatory under international law, because we care about ethics, both, you know, on a moral level and in terms of how people around the world view Israel. You know, so whether it's administrative detention issues, people can ask about that later, or whether it's one quote I'm going to read about, you know, who's doing the judging, who's observing the judging. There's all sorts of ideas out there. I'm not endorsing any of them. I sort of put a lot of them in the book, bring them to the reader, let people choose. But it's a good idea to be doing these reforms. One of the big things that the book talks about is from 2009 onward, the system created a whole new system for judging minors separately from grown-ups. Is it perfect? Is it not perfect? How good is it? That's like an important debate to have, but it's important to be making efforts to always improve observance of human rights to the extent possible. So this book, it's about human beings. Some are trying to save Israeli civilians from terrorism by putting terrorists in jail. I'd say 90% or so of the terrorists in Israel go through these courts, not through civilian courts. And it's also about, on another side, the Palestinian defense lawyers who are trying to make sure that human rights are observed in a complex situation. That's the big idea. All right, what do the courts do? All right, that's the big idea. What do the courts do? I'm going to give three main examples of what they do. Terrorism, stone throwing, and illegal border crossing. All right, the reason they exist is terrorism. People might remember This from 2000, this was this lynch in Ramallah that got photos all over the world because they had pictures of this Palestinian with blood on his hands, and I held on to the magazine. And he went through the courts. Most of the worst terrorists that you can think of go through these courts. That's why they exist. There's terrorism, it needs to be dealt with, and these courts deal with most of it. Now let's go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Average Palestinian, no, not a terrorist, not a criminal, very poor, wants to make more money, illegally crosses the border, a lot of times into the Jewish side of the West Bank to work for a Jewish employer who's happy to have him but didn't do the paperwork and nobody cared about the paperwork, didn't get an approval. They deal with a lot of that. And those people some of them don't go to jail at all. Some of them go to jail for a very short time. That's not what the human rights groups who criticize Israel are usually talking about a lot, but it is another big thing that the courts do. Another hot topic is the stone throwing, because the stone throwing a lot of times involves Palestinian minors. And what people need to understand about that, and I think the book does a good job at explaining, is that there's a wide spectrum of what stone throwing means. Okay, the book deals with the case of Asher Palmer, where somebody had a lookout and they drove in a vehicle going in the opposite direction, waited for a Jew, to spot a Jewish vehicle, and they were in a vehicle in the opposite direction and going at full speed through a rock, through the windshield of the moving Jewish car, and they killed them. And there's, I don't know, 5 or 10 cases of people who have been killed by rock throwing that way. That's murder, all right? Then there's a 12-year-old or 14-year-old Palestinian who throws a small pebble at a soldier who's 100 meters away from him. They don't get arrested, or they're not arresting those people at all. And then you have something in the middle. Somebody throws a rock that's large enough to maybe hurt somebody, but not, really badly hurt somebody, and then they make judgment decisions. A lot of the times, the first time that somebody does something like that, they won't arrest them. If they do it a bunch of times, they're more likely to arrest them. And those people, critics say, oh, it says on the books that those people could go to jail for 10 years or 20 years. They don't go to the jail for 10 years or 20 years. They usually go to jail for 3 months. So these are things to break down, but there's all sorts of philosophical and ethics questions to deal with regarding that. All right, I want to just very briefly read 2 passages from the book. I'm quoting Morris Hirsch. He was the chief prosecutor of the courts, who I got to interview extensively while I was writing the book. In the thousands of cases that I've dealt with through the course of my service in the prosecution, there are definitely cases that will always stand out for all types of reasons. Children that are murdered, shall have it pass, a baby sitting in a stroller in Hebron who was shot by a sniper, the case of the 3 kids who were abducted and murdered, the Itamar trial. But there are certain cases that stand out even among the standouts. Arch-terrorist Abdullah Barghouti, someone who was sentenced to 67 life sentences, 67 lives that he took. They don't care who they kill. He then mentions Mary Jane Gardner, who was a British non-Jewish woman who was killed in a bus stop in a random terror attack in Israel in March 2011. Hirsch said that Gardner was a tourist who had nothing to do with the conflict and was simply murdered by the way. That's terrorism. Terrorism doesn't distinguish who it's attacking, who its victim is going to be. And that's a big theme, I think, from Hirsch. One of the big themes in the book is murdered by the way. And that's something, critics who say the courts should be just, completely gone have to think about, how are you going to handle people who do things like that? The one other passage I want to read from the other side of the spectrum, this is Mirav Khoury, fascinating person, Israeli-Arab Christian woman, often defending very religious Muslim men who might not be comfortable in general with a woman defending them, but she's a great lawyer, so they're happy to have her. And one of the things that's interesting about her, she has a lot of criticism to say about the courts. If you ask her what's the best way to address the situation, she would say end the occupation and end the West Bank courts, like a lot of other Palestinian lawyers would say. But then she's practical. She said, okay, since that's not going to happen, she said, if the Palestinians were stuck with the courts anyway, she was saying that possibly a historic compromise could improve them by having some panels with a combination of Israeli and Palestinian judges. What was fascinating about this idea was that the Israeli government itself had endorsed having foreign observers, not Palestinians, but I think Americans, Europeans, and Australians, on a quasi-governmental committee, the Turkel Commission. I asked Curry if, aside from Palestinian judges, she thought a compromise of continuing IDF courts but adding in foreign judges or foreign observers might improve the situation. She said they might. Now, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, and to tell you the truth, when I brought it up with Saeb Erekat, a top Palestinian official, when I brought it up with Israeli officials, both of them were against it. But it's good to have a conversation about thinking about how can the situation improve. That's a big...
Why was the PA against foreign observers?
The PA was against it because all they want is they want the courts to be gone and the occupation to be gone, and they don't want any sort of intermediate compromise idea that could legitimize the courts, which is one thing that I liked about Meirav Khoury, was that she would rather the courts didn't exist, but she was willing to say, the situation could be better, if. And I meet with some European diplomats every now and then, and I've encouraged them that if Israel does some of these reforms, and some of these reforms, again, are being led, or pushes for some new reforms are being led within the system. The current Chief Justice is trying to make some reforms, not get rid of administrative detention, but reform it somehow. Again, we can talk about that later if people want to ask about it.
Just to interject for a second, it's so interesting for a lawyer to say that these courts shouldn't exist is so appalling, because let's say you're a citizen of Britain, but you commit murder in France. Everybody recognizes you are then subject to the jurisdiction of the state, of the nationality of the victim. Excuse me. So if there's a terrorist attack committed even in Israel proper, for a lawyer who's licensed to practice to make such a crazy sweeping statement that justice and the rule of law should not exist, I think is abhorrent.
So obviously I don't agree with the statement that the courts shouldn't exist. What they would say is, look, you don't have any Israelis being tried on the Palestinian side, and there's an imbalance. Now, again,
that is a question. If an Israeli citizen went into an area where the Palestinian Authority has jurisdiction pursuant to Oslo, would that Israeli not then be subject to the legal system of the PA if they committed a crime within that jurisdiction?
So the Israeli side doesn't trust the integrity of the Palestinian system, not just for dealing with Israelis, also for dealing with Palestinians, that the system itself is too much under the political influence of Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah party. In theory, and who knows, how many years or decades, if there's peace and both sides are mutually respecting each other, maybe that will happen someday. But in the meantime, it's not realistic. So, I don't agree with the statement that the courts shouldn't exist. I think the courts need to exist. The main thing I would highlight is it would be good if, when reforms, especially that are coming from within the Israeli system, it's good that they happen, and it would be nice if the international community also recognized some of these reforms, maybe reduced its criticism a little bit, and that's something that I talk with some of the diplomats.
I had a couple questions, obviously, and then I wanted to go into specific cases that are now being tried in these Israeli military courts. So first of all, I think it is so important that your book is out, and I'm so glad it is, for two reasons. Number one, like you said, there's so much misinformation when it comes to the Israeli justice system. And so information getting out there is key. And number two, also, to read about these cases, you really get a sense of the brutality of the terrorist attacks and the incitement and the indiscriminate nature that is terrorism, how it kills children, women, babies, innocents, people whose only crime is living or visiting the state of Israel. And so, number one, you mentioned the laws of armed conflict, and I've also spoke very frequently how we desperately need to update the laws of armed conflict, simply because terrorism by its nature, dealing on an asymmetric battlefield, you have someone, that I for example, exposed in my documentary film, The Making of a Martyr, where there are 8-year-old children who have bombs strapped around them being sent into the battlefield, excuse me, and blown up by remote control. When the Geneva Convention was authored, this type of terrorism, okay, maybe civilians as human shields, but using children as suicide homicide bombers?
Nobody ever was doing it systematically the way Hamas had a manual for doing it during the 2014 Gaza war, that they actually systematically had a manual for how do you use human shields to both reduce Israeli attacks and to maximize casualties to get sympathy from the world if Israel did attack, a location that was mixed military and civilian.
Right, and combined with the level of incitement that you actually spoke about as well in their school textbooks, television programs, radio programs in their schools by their religious clerics inciting these children to go to commit violence. Could you tell us, number one, how is the system, the juvenile detention system in these Israeli military courts? How do they operate? How are they different than perhaps what we have here in the United States? And number two, tell us about the judges. I think when we had a phone call, you said to me, these aren't judges who are sitting up on Olympus, who are in the clouds, detached from reality. These are men and women who have served, they've been on the battlefield, they know what the realities are, and they're making decisions keeping in mind very real national security issues, balancing the rule of law. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about those two factors.
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of how the courts are different from, I would say, both how they deal with grown-ups and juvenile courts in other places. So in terms of how they deal with grown-ups, the minors have more rights, special protections. The amount of time they can be put in detention in between when they need to see a judge for each hearing is shorter. The people who are questioning them need to have special training. The judges who deal with them need to have special training. They are often the same judges that are part of the overall system, but I guess I put it like this. If you have 10 judges that are, in a particular West Bank court, could also call them the Judea and Samaria courts. I use both in the book, but West Bank is sort of more known globally what it means. That's why we use that on the front. So anyways, let's say you have 10 judges, maybe 3 or 4 of them get special training, and those are the ones that deal with the juveniles. They don't have their hearings at the same time. They're kept in different parts of the prisons, and there's a variety of other protections that they have. Now, it's still not the same exactly as the juvenile system in Israel or in some democratic countries, because if you have a Palestinian minor who's 17 who committed the Itamar massacre, then basically, even though there's some things where they're still treated differently, like his name, I think during the up to a certain point was kept under gag order, and some certain procedural rights, he's going to be treated mostly as a terrorist because he murdered somebody. But other than that, if you're not dealing with a security crime, if you're dealing with something that's not violent, then at this point, the way that the Palestinian minors are treated is going to be much more similar. The one main difference is going to be that sometimes they don't get bail as often, and the reason for that is because if an Israeli, even if he commits a crime, he's usually going to come to the court if you put him on bail because you know where he lives, and it's easy to rearrest him, and it's not so easy to rearrest a Palestinian. They actually have a whole debated custom of sometimes doing night arrests, which is criticized, but the reason they do night arrests is they used to try to arrest people during the day, and they try to arrest one person, and 50 people might get hurt on both sides because the whole village would start a revolt about the one person that was, being arrested. So sometimes it means that some Palestinians might be detained up until the trial, even during their trial, because they haven't, figured out a way to deal with that. Otherwise, there's actually a pilot program that they've been working on for voluntary summons since about 5 or so years ago. It's had some success, but again, and this is maybe another idea that I think especially if some of the critics were a little bit more willing to acknowledge Israel for making efforts, even if the efforts weren't perfect, I think Israel also, it makes efforts on its own, but it might be able to even make more efforts.
Again, tell us a bit about the judges and why they're so unique in brief.
Okay, so the judges, you mentioned this is a great Israeli quote that we're not looking down from Olympus on these, the hearings because these judges, you know, they're serving in the military, and they are living in Israel where this conflict is happening, and many of them have, you know, friends or loved ones who have died. And if you live in Israel, it's not like it's happening every day, but there's way more of it than there is in any other democratic country, and that impacts things. And so, you know, when you consider if there's a borderline question, you could sort of go this way or that way. And in Sweden, where, you know, there's just nowhere near the same kind of, you know, terror threat, and there isn't like a broader terrorism wave going on, somebody might decide, all right, we're going to take a risk on national security and go towards human rights. Israeli judges do risk national security for human rights, and there's some decisions here where they did that, where they let go people who they knew were terrorists because they said, you know, you didn't follow proper procedure, so I'm letting this terrorist go, and next time follow proper procedure. But there are times where they say, you know what, we need to, you know, send this person to jail. We need to keep this person in detention because we are dealing with a unique situation. And one of my chapters I go through how much more terrorist threats there are against Israel than there are, let's say, against the United States. There's some statistics, and they're, you know, they're mind-blowing in terms of the difference if we take a look at it.
So the judges really have a sense of the real-world implications of the decisions that they're making.
Yeah.
One last thing before we get into the actual cases. It was so interesting. I have a colleague who works as a court reporter or a stenographer, let's say, who's basically taking the transcript with the juvenile military courts. And he told me that most often, because motive is obviously something that has to be proven and is discussed during a criminal trial, that the motive is not murder for these children. Not only is it fame, but it's money. Yep. And that the children are very often paid and promised payment for carrying out terrorist activities on behalf of adults. A perfect example, Hussam Abdu, who also I featured as the main character in my film, was paid the equivalent of $20 to take his own life as a suicide homicide bomber. Has there ever been a seminal case about incitement in these courts, taking the Palestinian Authority TV to court, or a religious cleric, or even any of the political leaders, or any of the teachers, for example, at the Islamic Jihad Academy, to court for their role of incitement to child abuse and murder?
In terms of incitement, there have been some Palestinian clerics and also some Israeli Arab clerics who have been sent to jail for incitement. It's a pretty high standard because it can't be covered. There's free speech protection. So if it is something that could theoretically be read in a philosophical sort of way of opposing the Israeli occupation, and it might have double meaning, they're not going to put somebody in jail for that. And there have been some times where they let people off, and there was a lot of criticism of the courts for letting them off. But if somebody sounds like they're calling for action, as opposed, to just words, and as opposed to something that could be interpreted in multiple ways, then there have been clerics who have been sent to jail for incitement. Another interesting trend that started during the knife intifada of 2015-2016 is they started sometimes sending people, not for a long time, but for short times, both in these courts and in the Israeli civilian court system, to jail for Facebook posts. Now, if you're somebody with 5 followers and you send, an emotional, I'm so mad at life and I also hate Israel, and somebody should do something against Israel, they're not going to arrest that person. But if you're somebody with a large number of followers and you have sort of a more concrete call on Facebook, they didn't want people to be able to sort of like use free speech in Facebook as a way to get wide, messages of incitement out, maybe even wider than they could if they made a public speech physically in person, and get away with it, sort of using Facebook as a way, as cover for free speech.
Right. Yeah, we've had multiple cases here in the United States which have actually all failed, civil cases against social media providers, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, trying to hold them liable for providing platforms to designated terrorist groups. But I think this is also a really good segue, I think, into the cases that we wanted to discuss.
Sure.
What was the decision of the High Court when it came to ruling on whether or not Arab MKs were indeed allowed to serve in the Knesset while committing incitement to violence?
This happened, right? We've had 2 elections in Israel over the last year, and there were rulings twice on issues of basically you had both very extreme Jewish candidates from the party Otzma, which is to the right even of, let's say, the main religious Zionist party. And basically people wanted to disqualify some of them from being able to run for the Knesset, and people also wanted to disqualify some of the Israeli Arab candidates for being able to run for the Knesset. And
because they were engaged in incitement?
Because incitement, yeah. And I can give some specific examples of the topics that they were talking about. First of all, one of them was referring to the State of Israel and the Justice Minister as Nazis. One of them was praising...
That's the Otzma Yehudit.
I'm sorry, this is the Israeli Arab.
The Israeli Arabs, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from the Israeli Arab side, they called the State of Israel, the Justice Minister, Nazis. They praised people who had attacked IDF soldiers as heroes. Which could be showing support for armed conflict against Israel, which is, there's a law that says if you want to run for the Knesset, you can't support armed conflict against the State of Israel. Makes sense. Basically, what was very controversial in the end was 2 of the Otzma people from the Jewish side were disqualified. One of them wasn't and was allowed to run. I'll talk about what they said and why in a second. And none of the Israeli Arabs were disqualified. And what the Israeli Arab lawyers said to the High Court was they said, each time, look, it could be interpreted in a philosophical way. The statement about, armed conflict wasn't really support for armed conflict. It was a question of, when Palestinians attack Israeli soldiers, that since they're soldiers, then they're not civilians, that's sort of like a state of war, and so that's not terrorism to attack soldiers. That's what I was saying. I wasn't calling for armed support against the State of Israel. I wasn't calling for terrorism against civilians. I was saying that it's not terrorism when, you're attacking Israeli soldiers. And Neil Handel from the Supreme Court said to the lawyer for the Israeli Arab side that you're asking readers of what this person said to do almost sort of like a schizophrenic analysis, or a law journal level analysis of what these people are saying when your average reader is going to read from this incitement and get from that incitement. Now, in the end, most of the justices, 8-1, said that they couldn't disqualify it because of this double reading possibility. They said, we find what the person said is reprehensible. It shouldn't be said. But according to the letter of the law as it stands, we can't disqualify them. Whereas for Michael Ben-Ari and Baruch Marzel, these were on the Jewish side, were disqualified. The third person who wasn't disqualified, Itamar Ben-Gvir. So Itamar Ben-Gvir is a lawyer, and so he was very careful that any statement that he made could not be interpreted in any sort of racist way. So Michael Ben-Ari, they said, you made statements about, Arabs aren't allowed to live in Afula, and you questioned the loyalty of all Arabs, and basically his statements couldn't be interpreted both ways. Now, I think if all you look...
So he was disqualified from running for office.
Yeah. So there were 2 Jewish candidates who were disqualified from running for office, and none of the Israeli Arabs were disqualified from running for office. Now, if you look at the letter of the law, it was an 8-1 ruling. There were even conservatives who joined it. If you look at the letter of the law, they might be right. It might be that the Israeli Arabs were more careful about using purposely phraseology that could be have double meanings, and that some of these Jewish candidates, other than the one who was a lawyer, weren't so careful with their phraseology. But if you, especially when you're talking about elections, if you step back and you think about the kind of message it sends to the society, I mean, the rest of the world, I think, was very impressed with the independence of the Israeli courts. But domestically in Israel, the idea that you're having people on both sides saying some very problematic things, and you're only disqualifying one side, it really, this hit poorly. This went poorly, I think, within Israel, not just on the right. There were also people on the center and the left who weren't happy with this kind of ruling. They said, look, either disqualify all of them on both sides, or don't disqualify any of them, but don't, just
yeah, I mean, it's a principle of basic equal protection
Fairness.
under the law and due process. So then let's go to the cameras bill, and if I get it right, it's called cameras because it's about cameras, right? And so Israel has a really big problem when it comes to fraud in the elections, and cameras can solve the problem. They have facial recognition technology, and they can make sure that in an area where only 100 people who are registered to vote, 500 votes don't come in, and so forth. So this is an ongoing case, which is my understanding. Tell us a little bit about it. Who brought the case? Where have they come down so far, and what do you think is going to happen here?
Right. So in the second election, or the first election was in April, the second election was in September. In the second election, the Likud party, which is right now at least still the ruling party in Israel, said we need cameras to try to catch voter fraud in the Arab sector. There had been reports, even in earlier elections, not just in the April election, of maybe higher voter fraud. And in fact, an election commission report, I think around 2012, had recommended moving in some sort of direction of placing cameras. Now, when they say cameras, they don't mean within the voting booth. They mean outside the poll area, so that they can see again who's entering, who's not entering. Exactly like Brooke said, and you can measure and see if too many people entered and voted, then you can start figuring out, who the wrong people might have been. Now, what the court said, the Attorney General of the court said, they didn't say you can't do this ever. What they said was, this was raised maybe only a few weeks before, and they said there's just not enough time, that even if it's a legitimate interest to protect against voter fraud, that with this little time, you do need to worry about privacy rights. You do need to worry about people voting. If it's done the wrong way, it might deter some people from voting, and nobody wanted that. So there needs to be basically a Knesset law. And in a debate in the Knesset that's not a few weeks, that might take months or it might take a year, to comprehensively sort of address all the different constitutional sides of the issue, and that there just wasn't enough time to do it. The police actually also said they didn't have enough time to put people all over the country. And the other thing they said is, look, it's true that there's a record maybe of higher voter fraud in the Arab sector, but some people would say there's also a record of higher voter fraud in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi sector. So if you're going to monitor it, it has to be everybody has to be monitored, and it can't just be in one particular sector. So this is going to be, like you said, it's going to be an ongoing issue. I think there's a good chance that sometime before the next election, which I hope is not soon, I hope we're going to have, one way or another, a new government in the next month or so. And so I hope it's not for like another 4 years. But before then, I think there is a good chance that there will be some sort of new law that addresses this issue, because the Attorney General made it clear that he also was in favor of the idea of having some sort of way of discouraging voter fraud, but then it needed to be addressed comprehensively, including all the distinct constitutional priorities, and not in a period of a few weeks.
I'm assuming they also require IDs to vote?
Yes.
In Israel?
Yes, they do.
Okay, good thing. So let's segue into the court cases against the Palestinian Authority by Palestinian Arabs who themselves are alleging torture. And it's so interesting because we started off the conversation where you were quoting very loosely a criminal defense attorney, a Palestinian woman who wishes the courts did not exist. But here you have Palestinian Arabs availing themselves of the Israeli court system because they have been tortured and abused under the Palestinian Authority, and obviously cannot seek or get any type of justice in the PA, which is essentially a theocratic dictatorship regime without the rule of law or any form of due process. Can you tell us who is suing who and why? What are the Palestinians asking the Israeli courts to do? And what has the effect on these Palestinian Arab plaintiffs been? I mean, I would assume that going to an Israeli court is like, you know, going to the enemy.
Absolutely.
What are they in, like witness protection programs? Like, how does that work?
All right. So let me really briefly, I'm going to say how it started, where we are today, and then we'll go through it in a more organized fashion. I reported this in a major report in July 2017, was the first major judgment that came down where an Israeli district court said that the Palestinian Authority can be held liable for torturing Palestinians in Israeli courts. A major, major precedential ruling, and it was one of the bigger stories that I've reported. I met a few of these Palestinians who were included in this, who were tortured by the Palestinian Authority. It's back in the news now for a couple reasons. First of all, it's back because some of the lawyers involved in this case have also now referred the same case to the International Criminal Court to see if the International Criminal Court might also go after the Palestinian Authority for what they've done.
They have already referred it?
They have already referred it.
Interesting.
The other thing is, there have been judgments, financial judgments that have been handed down, and again, I'll go through it, against the Palestinian Authority. The question is, can you collect judgments against the Palestinian Authority for them torturing Palestinians? And the answer might be yes. Somewhat disconnected, but it shows that the answer could be yes. You mentioned Shurat Hadin, so they got a big judgment in July against the Palestinian Authority in Israeli courts for terrorism during the Second Intifada, and they had previously in January put a lien on some land owned by Yasser Arafat, or his estate, in Israel in order to collect on that judgment. So there's assets there that could be collected from. Additionally, the Israeli government has sometimes been offsetting recently customs taxes that it collects from the Palestinian Authority because of the pay for slay issue. Brooke referred to that earlier, where somebody gets paid by the Palestinian Authority for committing terrorism, or their family gets paid for terrorism that they committed. So again, this starts in July 2017, and at a human level, I'll just describe to you the two men that I met. Were like obviously traumatized men, even though we had gone through a whole long process about them being able to talk to a journalist, and we'd protect their anonymity, and the picture that we took of them was like from their back so that you really couldn't see who they were, and we didn't use their names, and we changed their names, and we changed the real city that they actually lived in. They still, each of them almost freaked out and left, and we had like a whole another negotiation because they're just terrified for their lives that somebody's going to kill them, and they've already been beaten. One of them, it turns out, had nothing to do with Israel, no collaborating whatsoever. They just mistaken identity, or they weren't even careful. Maybe they just weren't making a point, so they arrested a whole bunch of people and tortured a whole bunch of them. That would send a message to the whole society, about if anybody was even thinking about the idea of helping Israel stop terrorism. The second one actually did cooperate with Israel, and the way he put it, he said, look, I wasn't spying on the Palestinian Authority. I'm pretty sure the case was, he sold out somebody, out a Hamas plot. And one of the powerful points that the Israeli court said why they could hold him liable, and why, the Palestinian Authority lawyers came and they said, he's a Palestinian, you can't hold him liable, and if he's spying on his own country, so to speak, he's a criminal. And they said, you signed the Oslo Accords, and the Oslo Accords said that you need to stop terrorism, and if he was helping fulfill your duty that you weren't able to do to help stop terrorism, he did nothing wrong. In fact, he helped you fulfill one of your duties under the Oslo Accords to help stop terrorism against Israel. So I thought that was a fascinating point. And one of them is in basically a witness protection sort of program in Israel and lives in Israel now and is being sort of taken care of by the Israeli government. And the other one, much less. The other one, I think, moves around basically his life, both of their lives are a certain amount ruined and they can't speak with their families anymore, but his life is really ruined. He had nothing to do with Israel, so no one's, specifically taking care of him other than these lawyers might be able to get him some money in this case. And if these lawyers hadn't brought the case, then he'd have nothing. Some of the things they did, beating them on all parts of their body, hitting them with lead pipes, extinguishing cigarettes on them, hanging them in torture positions. One of them he had healthy teeth that were pulled out instead of attending to his unhealthy teeth on purpose. So very, very clear torture. So there have already been some judgments. November 2018, the Supreme Court endorsed 2 judgments totaling 14 million shekels. That's for false imprisonment. The judgments might be much, much bigger when they get to the torture. They haven't actually given out yet the judgments, the monetary judgments for torture. So those are still up and coming. We might talk about that some other time.
Just 2 more points, and then we'll open it up. You mentioned really briefly there to sell land to a Jewish person is a crime under PA law. So have there been cases where Palestinians have used the Israeli courts to seek justice, to reverse any type of punishment for them simply engaging in free commerce with somebody who is a Jew?
I don't think so. I mean, I am familiar with, there was a case with, it wasn't a court case, with the International Legal Forum and some others helped campaign to get a Palestinian who was arrested by the Palestinian Authority for selling land.
Right, that was like last year. I remember that was recent. What happened with that?
So he was freed I think maybe, I have to look back at, I think maybe he might have also had some American citizenship.
Right.
And so the U.S. Embassy weighed in on his behalf, and I think because of that, they ended up freeing that person from Palestinian detention. I don't think there's been a case yet where somebody was tortured for selling land that got into the Israeli courts. I think again, some of these people were random people who were arrested and tortured, but I think the Palestinians said they were torturing them because of, collaboration with Israel as an informant.
It's interesting they admit to it. They say, yes, we did, but here's our affirmative defense to torture.
I mean, they say with a wink, no, we didn't. Yeah. But if we did, then they were spies, so it's okay.
And I have to ask this because I'm just so fascinated with the whole notion that the Israelis referred one of the cases to the International Criminal Court.
Yes.
Doesn't that seem to go against everything they're doing to prevent ICC jurisdiction over not just Israel, but the so-called occupied territories? How can they square the two? Or do they know the ICC is not going to take it and then set a precedent for them?
I think that might be so point number one, right? And so what Brooke is referring to is certainly for a long time, the Israeli government was being very careful not to try to refer things to the ICC against the Palestinians because they just want the ICC to stay out of the whole thing. Israel has its own legal system. It prosecutes sometimes its own soldiers, its own people if they commit alleged war crimes. And that would mean the ICC has no jurisdiction to come in. Also, Palestine isn't a state, according to Israel and the United States and some other countries. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why the ICC wouldn't have jurisdiction. And so the idea would be don't send anything to the ICC because we just want them to stay out of it. So, but then there's private groups that operate. So there have been private groups sending complaints against Palestinians to the ICC for already dating back to, I think, 2014, 2015. And the group that sent it was another private group, the Jerusalem Institute for Justice. So they're not necessarily, I mean, not that they don't care about the big picture, but I think their assumption is this maybe could still help Israel because it shows all the sides. Well, if you're going to rule against Israel, you ICC, you're also going to have to rule against the Palestinians. Do you want to have to rule against the Palestinians? Maybe it's better for you not to rule against anybody and just stay out of all of this, because you're going to have to, maybe some of your supporters on the Palestinian side will get mad at you if you also are going against the Palestinians. And if you want to be fair-handed, you can't do both. And then the other thing is, I think what you said about there's a public relations value to going to the ICC and making a statement that, sort of maybe gets, some broader play, especially once the ICC issues a ruling about it. That might get reported on a wider basis, just than something that an Israeli court happens to issue about it.
Thank you. Yonah, that's so interesting. I've really been looking forward to this for a long time, and I'm glad I got to ask my question. So now we're going to open it up. So the question is, are there procedural differences between the West Bank military courts and the regular Israeli civilian courts?
All right. So in most cases, the answer is that the rules of evidence and the rules of procedure are the same or very close to the same. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to bring evidence. A confession by itself, in and of itself, is not enough. You have to, there's an Israeli principle of law that you need something, external evidence on top of a confession, to convict somebody. There's, all sorts of the Miranda rights that you have, the right to remain silent and the right to a lawyer. They definitely, Palestinians have the right to a lawyer. So on most of these things, in a regular court case, which is most of what the West Bank or the Judean Samaria courts deal with, on most things, on the books, they're similar. Administrative detention is very different. Israel has more administrative detention than anyone else, and that's something I acknowledge in the book. But again, I also bring the stats that Israel has far more threats and terrorism than anyone else. Critics say sometimes that there's absolutely no judicial proceedings. That's wrong. There are judicial proceedings. Judges need to see the people who are going to be detained at the beginning of the case, and then they need to see them at least every 6 months. And there are cases where judges say, no, you can't detain somebody, or they say, you wanted to detain them for 6 months, I'll only give you 3 months. Most of the time, the judges approve the detentions. Why? Because most of the time, the intelligence is really good, and they have to stay in detention up until they're indicted or even through their trial, because it's so hard for Israel to guarantee that they'll show up for their trial if they let them go.
So it seems to be, according to our guest, that there are 2 cases which I guess the theme is soft on Arabs, tough on Jews. And as an example, you used the Ari Fold murder case, where you have someone who's clearly been murdered, an innocent civilian, and that's now on trial. Why do we need such an extensive trial for murder if the facts are obvious? And number 2, Elior Rizal Azaria, who is a soldier who killed a terrorist, someone I believe who was already had submitted and was arrested, basically. So he was lying down on the ground, and then he was killed by a soldier who clearly had, some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. Talk about the 2 cases and the differences and your opinion about that, please.
First of all, I'm going to respond on the sort of emotional level and then on the legal level, and they're 2 different things. On the emotional level, I get what you're saying. I do. When there's so much Palestinian terrorism, and there's so much Palestinian terrorism, and I've seen it, with my own eyes. I've seen the terrorists. I've been there was my first year in Israel. There was they call it Molotov cocktails. It was a gasoline bomb blew up on Route 443 while myself and some friends were on the highway, and we stopped in the middle of the highway, and ourselves and all the other cars on the highway went in reverse on like this major highway where people are driving, 50 miles an hour. We were driving in reverse 50 miles an hour to escape this gasoline bomb. So So I feel the emotional issue when it's like, well, why do we even need to give a trial? This guy, murdered. A lot of times, they might even have it on videotape and the guy is confessing. Why do we need to waste all this time? And in the second case, you have, a soldier who was drafted into the IDF. He wasn't given a choice. The IDF, in Israel drafts everyone, or almost everyone. And he killed a terrorist. The person who he shot had stabbed an Israeli soldier. Wasn't all right. That's the emotional level. The legal level, I'm going to be a lot more cerebral, and the answers I think are pretty clear. Everybody on a legal level has to get a trial. If you start figuring out who you should give a trial to and who not to give a trial to, it can go to some dark places that you might not want to go, both for our own identity and also in terms of how Israel's viewed worldwide. And so one of the things that I think I might make clear in this book is, there's some cases where some Israeli military court judges criticize, let's say, the police for not properly giving somebody all of their rights. And you could say, oh, look, this shows that Israel is discriminating against the Palestinians. Or you could say, look, there was a judge who was wearing a military uniform who was independent enough to criticize the police for not following the rules. And this shows that Israel takes democracy seriously, even when it's dealing with issues of terrorism. That's by the way, the guy who killed Ari Folda is going to go to jail for life. I'm following the case, and he hasn't been convicted yet, but he's going to get convicted. In terms of the Elor Azaria, I will say that I had 3 phases, and I wrote maybe 100 articles on this. I was thinking about doing a book about it at some point. Maybe I'll come back at some point. So I followed it a lot. My first phase was I saw the video of the soldier Azaria shooting the guy on the ground, and I said, that's horrible. He's got to go to jail for this. Then I saw the videos of people calling out, he's got a bomb, he's got a bomb. All right, and that was absolutely happening. And so Azaria could have been hearing, these calls, he's got a bomb, when he shot him. And whether it was reasonable or not reasonable, there is an idea that, if somebody's in an operational situation, and he hadn't been in a situation like this before, and he's a young kid, he's not 30 with all sorts of experience. So maybe he freaks out and makes a mistake. Why do you send him to jail? It comes to my third phase. My third phase, and not everybody knows this, but because I was in the trial for almost the whole thing, I can tell you that this specific soldier, there are other soldiers that have not been sent to jail and that have not been tried. This specific soldier confessed in real time to one of his commanders that he did it because he was mad and he wanted to get revenge. That's why he went to jail. That's what the judges said in the case. If he hadn't said that to his commander, and what his lawyers tried to do, and then they said, well, he was freaking out in real time, he didn't really mean it, the judges believed that he really meant it. If he hadn't confessed to his commander, it might have gone differently, because people were freaked out, and there have been cases. One thing they brought in their defense, they said there have been cases where somebody was shot once, they were just attacking somebody with a knife, and then they did have a bomb. It wasn't an imaginary thing. There have been cases where somebody was shot and they thought the incident was over, they'd stabbed one person, and it turned out they had a bomb and they hurt more people. So it wasn't a theoretical case. It's actually happened in Israel. But I don't think that's what happened here because of his confession.
And Azaria was sentenced to what?
So he was sentenced initially to 18 months in prison, and he ended up serving 9 months after he got some of it commuted and good behavior.
And the person who he shot that was lying down was arrested for doing what?
The person who shot that he killed had stabbed an Israeli soldier moments before, minutes before.
So the question is, in the event that a minor detonates him or herself in an act of terrorism, is there any recourse against the parents? And before you answer that, I just want to also tell you a little bit about an experience that I had. Right. When I was filming my documentary, The Making of a Martyr, I had the opportunity to interview many parents of children who had either been arrested for attempting to commit acts of terror or who had carried acts of terrorism out. And it was interesting because, for example, the parents of Hussam Abdu were adamant and spoke to me very bravely on camera and said, we do not support what our son did. We are against it. They were crying. They were distraught, like any other parent would be, that their son was in jail. It was brave because speaking to the media against the Palestinian Authority and against one of the terrorist groups that recruited Hussam, which happened to be the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, is equivalent to collaboration with the Israelis. And many parents, because of that, because of the fear, they'll say one thing on camera, they'll support an act of terror, but off camera, they'll say something else as well. When we interviewed some of the designated terrorist groups, they explained to us how careful they were, that they told the kids not to tell their parents what they were doing because they did not want the parents to stop them. So it's a mixed bag, but in the event that it is shown that the parents did perhaps contribute to and facilitate and aid and abet their child to commit an act of terror, are any actions, whether it's for, again, aiding and abetting terrorism or even simply child abuse, have any of those actions been brought? Okay,
so we'll distinguish a couple of things. First of all, you have cases where the parents had nothing to do with it, and then you're not necessarily going to do anything against the parents. Maybe you'll do something against whoever did send the child. If the parents were involved, then you're going to look at what the involvement meant. If there was direct involvement, if they actually conspired with the child, then absolutely. They can be criminal conspirators. You know, depending on how involved they were, they might even be able to be, you know, alleged co-murder conspirators. They might, you know, actually get life in prison. It depends, you know, like anything else, you know, in judging someone who didn't actually, you know, pull the trigger but was involved. Depends, you know, how involved they were, but absolutely they could be criminally prosecuted. The maybe most interesting question is, what if they weren't conspiring, but they sort of knew and they created a certain environment? So I could be very honest. I was writing about a bill that Ayelet Shaked, who was Justice Minister until a few months ago, was pushing a couple years ago about, I believe, holding the parents liable for some sort of civil damages and some sort of other sort of secondary consequence. You know, not putting them in jail, but, you know, doing something that sort of gave a cost to parents that would hopefully motivate parents to control their children or to inform on their children. And by the way, there have been a number of terrorism plots that were prevented by parents who did inform on their children. There definitely was a push to put some sort of a cost on parents who, again, were not directly criminal conspirators, but maybe had some sort of a negligent role in their kid being involved.
Thank you, Yonah, for coming today. The book, again, is called Justice in the West Bank, ? The answers are inside. I encourage everybody to buy it and obviously to read it. I want to thank everybody for joining us today on JBS. I am Brooke Goldstein, the founder and executive director of the Lawfare Project, the world's only pro-Israel litigation fund. You can find us online at thelawfareproject.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.